In order to allow Professor Berman as much time as possible at the microphone, I'll make the introduction brief, not in any way to slight him. He is a very distinguished and delightful person. It's been a pleasure for me to get to know him over the years, and I admire his insights, his personality. You'll be happy to know that he's an Orthodox rabbi as well as a biblical scholar. And he's married, has 4 children, and misses them. He was texting to his wife yesterday about things going on here at BYU. So this is his first time to BYU, but he is very sensitive and generously aware of many of the things that he finds that he resonates with and that I too share with him. So I would like to point out to you, if you haven't read or known of his publications, I hope you'll read a couple of his books, one on the temple that we mentioned last night. Also a book on narrative analogy in the Hebrew Bible, talking about battle stories and their equivalent non-battle narratives, published by Brill in 2004. I haven't read that one myself yet, but I'm eager to get it and look at battle narratives in the Book of Mormon and see how they stack up with what, Joshua, you found there. And in terms of contemporary issues, his book Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, is published by Oxford 2008, and one that as equality becomes more and more a matter of great interest to us jurisprudentially in the United States, I think that would be well worth our looking at to see how biblical precepts stand behind a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in the United States socially. Professor Berman has obviously engaged in a wide spectrum of topics and addressed a number of public audiences, but today he's going to focus very specifically on one particular set of inscriptions. He has already presented this material in other very prestigious venues, so it comes already improved and vetted by some of the best scholars in the world. Joshua, we welcome you. Please come up, and we look forward to hearing from you. Please join us.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What a thrill to be with you here this morning, and I want to thank everyone again who came out last night. I see already many familiar, warm faces and friends from our talk last night. Before I begin to move into my topic this morning about the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II, I have some prefatory remarks that I want to make that I think sort of instill the spirit of my visit here and of this wonderful institution. I'm curious, how many of you out here in the audience are students currently studying ancient Near Eastern studies? Nice number, terrific. And the rest of you, presumably, if you could be young again, would do the same, and that's why you're here. Okay. I want to say a remark and aim it at 2 different audiences. To those of you that are studying, I hope that you are already realizing as you make your way through these fields that there isn't just one way to parse all of the evidence, that in almost everything there is debate within scholars. There are very few actually assured results about dating of things, accuracy of things. These things are very up in the air and hazy. And, you know, sometimes for people who are coming to Scripture from a position of faith, and then they hear, well, the scholars say otherwise, and of course they are objective, and they have all the scientific proof, and it leaves those of us in faith in kind of a tough place between a rock and a hard place. But those of us that are more in the material know, well, you know, it isn't such an assured truth, and there are some other ways to connect the dots. But very often, to connect the dots the right way, you have to be open to certain assumptions. You have to be willing to step out of the accepted prisms in order to do so. And I've come here this morning looking for a few good men and women to join us in this endeavor. If you think, well, I'm just 19, 20, 21, and this Egyptian stuff is so hard, and I could never be anything. Well, I could never have been anything. And Professor John Gee here, my esteemed colleague, also could never. You know, we're all young once upon a time. And if you want it, as Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, said, it is no dream. It is in your hands to make come true. And the field desperately needs you, and those in your faith desperately need you, so that when they come up with questions, but how could it be? The scholars say this, and the evidence says this, and my tradition says otherwise. We need the people who, with full integrity, critically, intellectually, can say, wait a minute, you know, there's another way to look at things. And for those of you that have already moved on to later stages in life, and you also sometimes might encounter, gosh, I Googled Exodus, and, you know, up came 15,000 entries that said it never existed, it never was anything. You have to know that there are many scholars that would say that, but you owe it to yourself to then look for, and there always are the scholars who say, well, you know, here, you can put together the material this way and get a different picture. And part of what I'm trying to do this morning is give a sense of what those alternative narratives might be about this thing, the myth of the Exodus. The myth of the Exodus is a myth. That is a little bit of what I want to talk about here this morning. I want to begin, friends, with some observations that scholars are universally agreed upon, but somehow have gone under the radar. This is stuff that really everybody needs to know. It's about a series of inscriptions called the Kaddish Inscriptions of Ramses II. Let me give a little bit of background about this. Okay, here we have a map of the ancient Near East in the 13th century BCE, the late Bronze Age. This is at the height of what we call the New Kingdom of Egypt. Egypt, like all ancient empires, it waxed, it waned, it had its high points. This might have been really the high point of the whole period for Egypt. What you can see here is that if we, from a biblical perspective, normally think of the ancient Near East as, well, you have Canaan, and then you have Babylon and Assyria. Those are the really big powers. They're not in the picture at this time. What we have here during this period is really something that's much more akin to what we're familiar with in our generation, in our day, with what might be termed a kind of the Cold War. You know, after World War II, basically the world split into a bipolar world, two superpowers, and then all the littler countries in between would have to pick and choose. Do you want to be in the orbit of the Soviet Union? Do you want to be in the orbit of the United States? And this really well describes what's going on here. You have two empires at this time. We have Egypt to the south and the Hittite Empire in Anatolia to the north. And then what you have is that outside of their home turf in the middle, the land bridge between Asia and Africa, what's called the Levant, are dozens of little city-states. And these little city-states would have to pick and choose whose side did they want to be on. And they were very good at this. They were deft at leverage. Who seemed to be stronger now? The Hittites, the Egyptians. Their allegiances would jump back and forth. So if right here you see the kind of the dividing area between Egypt's sphere of influence and the Hittite kind of around here. Sometimes the line was here, sometimes the line was here, sometimes the line was about here. It was a very fluid and changing situation. This is the period that gives rise to what are known as vassal treaties, because all of these little city-states in here, Byblos, Tyre, Jerusalem, other places, would have to align themselves with one of the bigger empires. And the treaties that they would make, of which were very, very documented, particularly the ones with the Hittite Empire, seem to be the basis for the biblical notion of covenant. That is, structurally, there are a whole bunch of elements that we find in those treaties which structure, basically, the book of Exodus, the book of Deuteronomy. And this is well documented, and we can talk about that a little bit later. My interest for this morning is this. So we have these little city-states here, and the Hittites and the Egyptians are vying for influence. And at a place called Kaddish, which is on the Orontes River, it's right about here, separating modern-day, or what was, Syria from Turkey, right about here. Kaddish was also one of these places going back and forth, and shortly after the rise of Ramses II, otherwise known as Ramses the Great, who reigned for the better part of the 13th century, some 80-something years or so, 70, 80 years. He led a battle to bring his troops up the coast to Kaddish to stave off not just the Hittites, but all of their collaborators around who were trying to push this white area down and down and down and become stronger and thereby threaten Egypt. This was, scholars are fairly certain, or there's a guess, that the Battle of Kaddish was the largest chariot battle ever in history. We have an extensive record of it from the Egyptian perspective, these Kaddish inscriptions, which I'm going to speak about shortly, and also some hints of it from Hittite writings as well. So it was a big battle. Now, who won? Who won the Battle of Kaddish? Well, as I said, we have Egyptian sources and we have Hittite sources. The Hittites claim that the Hittites won, and the Egyptians claim that the Egyptians won. So we're not 100% certain, but what's important for me this morning is not who won the Battle of Kaddish. It's all about impression. It's all about perception, and that's what I want to talk about, the perception of this battle back home in Egypt once Ramses came home. See, what happened is that after the battle, whatever it was that happened there, Ramses comes back to Egypt and does something that's very unusual. It was commonplace to put up a victory stela or a monumental inscription, but here Ramses really went to town. He plastered the country with inscriptions about this Battle of Kaddish. We know of at least 10 inscriptions across Egypt about this battle. That makes the Battle of Kaddish the most publicized event in all of ancient history, including Greek and Roman history. And that had never really happened, that something would be totally publicized everywhere. When I say publicized, let me explain what I mean. There are monumental inscriptions down here in Thebes and the big temples that are there, but also there were, we have found papyrus versions of this as well. This is a papyrus version of one of the Kaddish inscriptions, and what's fascinating about this inscription is where it was found. You know, one of the questions that we always have with ancient Near Eastern writings is who would read this stuff? Even about Roman literature, how many people knew all that stuff, or the Greek plays, etc.? Was that just a kind of aristocratic, knowledgeable, upper crust sect? Well, and certainly when you're talking about hieroglyphics, very, very few people could read hieroglyphics. But this is in hieratic, which is a little easier to read. And what's really important about this papyrus is where it was found. It was found in a workman's village. That is, right next to Thebes, they had a whole little compound, a place called Deir el-Medina, where just common workmen, maybe even some slaves too, would live. And then in the morning, they'd take their lunch pail and trudge off to the temple site and build. And this was found there, together with other wisdom writings and love poems and things like that. And it buttresses the claim of scholars that apparently this inscription about the Battle of Kaddish wasn't merely for priests to read or for the gods to read. Many inscriptions in the ancient Near East were really reports to the gods. Here's what I did. Have a look. I chiseled it on a big mountainside for you. No, that this was a kind of little red book. That is, this was something that would be widely read to even popular people so that they would learn about the gods and about Ramses and about his achievements, etc. Not many people could read this, but reading and writing in the ancient world functioned a little bit different than today. Today, all of us here in this room can read. To read means to open a text and to meditate on it silently, like this. But that wasn't what happened in the ancient world. In the ancient world, if you had in a village just one or two people who could read, and not hieroglyphics, hieratic, which is easier to read, then they could read aloud to the public. And so a lot of people had access to texts. In fact, in Hebrew, you really know this, from the word to read and the word to call out, likro, are the same word, because that's what reading was. So access to texts was hardly limited to those who were truly literate. An entire community could have access to a text as well. And the finding of this document, this papyrus, in a lower class setting, really buttresses the argument that this was something that was widely disseminated and widely known. Now, I want to begin my own comments about what it says in this inscription with some observations that scholars made some 80 years ago. The inscriptions that Ramses put up were partly in hieroglyphic. They were narrative, poetic, some mix of narrative and poetic, but also, for the first time, we find in Egyptian art and iconography pictorial representations, not just one still image, but one relief after another, something that would look to us almost like a comic strip, what they call today an illuminated novel. What's it called? Graphic novel. Yeah, my son is very into those. A graphic novel about the Battle of Kaddish with, 10 or 12 panes, P-A-N-E-S, that depict the different stages of the battle, and that these panes, these reliefs, are at least 3 or 4 or 5 different sites in Egypt in different stages of preservation. I want to share an observation that scholars made about what they discovered in some of these bas reliefs. Well, here we have Ramses' camp. And what I've got the focus on here in the middle is this. This is Ramses' throne tent, right? Because Ramses led his troops to the field of battle. He was right there. And of course, he was at the center of the camp. You can see the camp has a kind of guard around it, these shields. And this is Ramses' camp. This is Ramses' throne. Now, you'll take my word for it, but if you can already see clearly that around the throne tent, there is the smaller chamber and the larger chamber. In the smaller chamber, presumably, is where Ramses would hold forth. And the outer chamber was a kind of receiving chamber. And around the throne tent was a wall like this. Now, the throne tent itself, as I said, split into two, has the following dimensions. The proportion of this, the length to the height, and also the width, was 3 to 1, 3 to 1. And this is 1 to 1. Let's see why that's significant. Let's have a look at another image from somewhere else. Here again, you have this in one of the other sites, and it's the same thing. 3, 1, 2 chambers. Here's Ramses. Here's the reception chamber. You can see clearly surrounded on 4 sides by some type of wall delimiting the encampment. Now, what scholars said is, hey, this is really interesting. You have this chamber, this tent that has 2 parts, 3 to 1. One part is 2 to 1. One part is 1 to 1. Surrounded by a wall, surrounded by an outer encampment. That all says one thing: tabernacle. Tabernacle. Okay, in other words, let's just put it this way. Let's say this conservatively. This is what we find in the depiction of the tabernacle as well. That is, you have the Holy of Holies. That would be here. You have an outer chamber here. We don't know what the exact dimensions were, right? Because this is a picture. All we have are the proportions. And the proportions are exactly the same. And of course, the tabernacle had a wall around it. And of course, the tabernacle was situated in the center of the Israelite camp, 4 sides, and what were on the 4 sides of the 4 sides of the tabernacle in the Israelite camp? The Israelite army, right? That is how the book of Numbers portrays the Israelites as they encamped in the desert. They were a troop on the march. And this pretty much says it all. This is exactly what we see here. It says all the same things that I said. You'll notice that I have the map. It would appear to us to be upside down. Egyptian depictions have the east on the left and the west on the right. Maybe that's because the Nile flows upside down. I don't know. But this is maybe John would know more about that than I do. But this is the fact that Egyptian depictions have east on the left and the west on the right. And so the orientation is the same. And I'll just add one thing. You can see here that I have this corridor here. Let's advance one more picture. This is in another picture there. And you can see again the same thing. Here's the throne tent. Here is the wall around. Here are the armies on all the sides. And then you can see here that there seems to be a passageway, a corridor, that leads to outside the encampment, so that you enter the whole encampment, and you enter the throne tent from the east, again, because they have east on the left side, right? So that what you have then, is the same thing. It's not only are all the proportions the same, but the orientation is the same. The entrance will be from the east in both. Now, just one more thing that scholars pointed out. Here we have more detail than we have in the other reliefs that we saw before. Let's blow that up a bit. We're looking at it now. What do we have here? Well, here is the throne tent. Now, in the middle, they didn't want to draw a picture of Ramses the size of my thumb. That wouldn't be, that wouldn't be very honorable. So what we have here is called a cartouche. That means a little scarab that has the royal name, the eponym of Ramses written on it. So here is, figuratively speaking, Ramses, and he is surrounded by, well, no, he wasn't surrounded by cherubim, but that's putting the things together already. He's surrounded in Egyptian lore and symbolism by the god Horus, who is a falcon, and the falcon has their wings spread out as if the god Horus is giving protection to Ramses. And as you can see, there are two wings. Right? You can see the wing here. It's a little dimmer than the other. Two wings, two falcons on each side. And these are Ramses, presumably his servants. Maybe they're prisoners who've been taken in. But that's what you have. Now that's very interesting, because as someone here already made the connection, what you have inside the Holy of Holies, inside the tabernacle, is in the center the object of greatest significance and consecration, right? Not Yahweh, but the Ark, right, of the covenant, the Ark of the Lord. And above the Ark of the covenant, says Exodus, we have two cherubim, right, with their wings spread out in protection, hovering over the Ark of the Lord. So this whole array of similarities is something that scholars have known about for about 80 years. It's important to put these into context. As interesting as they are, and methodologically, this is how we have to work. We always have to, well, that's interesting. But before we can jump to any conclusions, we would need to know how distinct, how significant is this? If we were to discover that bas reliefs of army encampments across the ancient Near East always had the throne tent of the king in the middle, and always had two chambers, a 1-by-1 chamber, and then a 2-by-1 chamber, and always had a corridor leading in from the east, then we would know that what's happening here in the Kaddish bas reliefs, and maybe also in the book of Exodus, are just part of a wider, more common stock image that we have across the ancient world. But the fact is that that's not the case at all. Very, very few bas reliefs from the ancient Near East depict the king anywhere on the battlefield. And those that do, the Neo-Assyrian ones, the camp is oval, the king is somewhere else. There's really nothing at all that nearly approximates this. In fact, when we look for any type of similarity to the tabernacle, in any sort of genre of writing or of pictorial depiction in the ancient Near East, nothing approximates the tabernacle as much as the throne tent of Ramses II. That means there is no picture of any cultic site, of any other holy tent, of any other temple that looks like the tabernacle more so than the throne tent of Ramses II. And even conceptually, it makes sense. Ramses is the divine, in Egyptian terms, the divine leader who will lead his people, his troops, out to battle. And in the book of Numbers, Yahweh is the divine king at the center of the camp who will lead his troops out to battle. That's how Israelites are portrayed in Numbers. They are in legions with flags and all that. They are battles. Letziv otam, in their ranks and in their legions. Well, as I say, that's been on the books for about 80 years. I don't know why more people don't. I didn't know about this until about 4 or 5 years ago. It's just some things just get under the radar. One of the reasons, honestly, I think that this gets under the radar is that this is bad news for a lot of biblicists, because it implies that maybe there was something having to do with Egypt, something similar to an Exodus. It says that the origins of the tabernacle are not post-exilic. They're not in the time of Josiah. They're way before that. It doesn't jive with what a lot of biblicists want to be able to say. And so they just say, well, this is all coincidence. Well, at what point does something become not a coincidence? That's always the easiest thing. Our data is somewhat limited, and so each person can make their own determination. Is this just a coincidence? When I say, and this everyone agrees, there's nothing else that remotely looks like any of this, I think for me, is it a slam dunk proof? We don't have slam dunk proofs in the ancient Near East. Is it something that one can say this has a reasonable possibility to it? It's an interesting piece of datum that we can't just brush under the table. I think that is a fair way to look at it. Now, having been exposed to this material in Jim Hoffmeyer's wonderful book, Israel in Ancient Egypt, and there's a second book, Israel in Sinai, something like that, I thought to myself, this is interesting, all this pictorial stuff from the Kaddish inscriptions. I didn't really know anything about the Kaddish inscriptions beforehand, and I thought, I'd like to go read the narrative portions of those Kaddish inscriptions. I was certain that there was a whole lot of secondary literature about the Kaddish inscriptions and whatever they might show relative to, or light they might shed on biblical passages. But, sometimes, I'm sure all of you have had this as well, you want the thrill of encountering the primary text, unaided. What do I see? And then, if I see that a scholar came with it, I'm going to say, great, that's great, look at that. I managed to come up with the same insight that a scholar did. In rabbinic tradition, that's always a great thing when someone reads a passage of the Talmud and comes up with an insight, and then you discover that one of the great medieval rabbis did that. You're supposed to say, blessed is the Lord that I came up with the same insight as a great scholar in Israel. So I wanted to see if I could come up on my own with insights, and then later discovered that I had just come up with insights of the great scholars of the ancient Near East. Okay, now, I read the inscriptions. It's very long and detailed. In fact, I don't know if there's another battle description in the ancient Near East that is as long and detailed, really down to hours and numbers and places, as much as this description. Let me tell you how it starts off. I want you to have your biblical thinking caps on now, okay? I'm thinking Exodus, all right? This is what Ramses says. He says, well, it all sort of started off going back to our first, it started off by me leading my 4 divisions, I think, from home, from here, from P. Ramses, that was his capital, in the Delta. I led my 4 divisions on a march. Off we went. We marched. All of our chariots, we were marching and marching, until we got to Kaddish, and then suddenly, from out of nowhere, we were set upon by the Hittite chariot force. They came out of nowhere. And what Ramses says, actually, is that his divisions were kind of strung out over a long distance. He says, my gosh, we were all so shocked that the Hittites had gotten the best of us, that my troops, they just broke rank in fear. They panicked and ran away. And Ramses says, and there I was, all alone. And so what did I do? Ramses says, well, all that was left for me to do was to pray. I prayed to Ammon, Egyptian god. And he prays and prays, and then Ammon comes to Ramses and says, I am with you. Move forward, go forward, you alone, single-handedly, go forward against the Hittites, and I will be with you, and you shall win. Okay? Now, let's think Exodus, right? Think of Exodus 13 and 14. The Israelites are marching, and suddenly what happens? They're set upon by a chariot force of Egyptians. And it says that they were sorely afraid, and they broke rank, and Moses was left alone. And Moses cries out to God. And God says, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yisau, speak to the Israelites and go forward, and I will be with you, and you will emerge victorious. That's all step 1. Now, what happens next is that Ramses becomes invested with divine powers from Ammon. And he charges into the Hittites single-handedly. It says this dozens of times, that he fought this battle against thousands of chariots single-handedly. He says that he would go in to fight this battle, and he would be aided by the Uraeus serpent. These are images of Ramses II, and you can see something that I'm sure we've all known without knowing exactly what it was. This thingy up here, this little ornament, and you can see it in this as well, was the symbol of the god Sekhmet, the Uraeus serpent. And what this serpent would do was spew fire. And what Ramses says is, I charged into the Hittites, and there was my Uraeus serpent, symbolizing the god Sekhmet, spewing fire at the Hittites and confounding them and instilling in them great fear. And you may recall that when the Egyptians begin to cross into the sea, do you remember it says God appeared before them in a pillar of fire and they became confounded? What we find next in the Hittite inscription is that the Hittite troops say, oh, that is the god Sekhmet fighting for them. Oh, we are doomed. Let us flee. In other words, the enemy is given voice for them to affirm the power that is now about to defeat them. That's really unusual in ancient Near Eastern writings. And of course, we have this exactly in Exodus 14. It says that the Egyptians said, Hashem nilcham lahem b'Mitzrayim, vayanusu. Oh, it is Yahweh who is fighting for them against Egypt. Let us flee. And they tried to flee. Now, what happens next is that they try to flee. Now, let's see what's happening here. Can you find Ramses? That's never a problem. Well, here he is, okay? And then we have this big mess. But what we need to focus on is here. This is actually the city of Kaddish. And around the city of Kaddish, apparently on both sides, flows the river Orontes around. It's got like a natural moat. And what Ramses depicts is that the fleeing Hittite troops, because of the onslaught of the archers of Ramses, they in order to take shelter, they jumped into the water. What Ramses says is they jumped into the water like crocodiles, right? Because crocodiles, if they sense harm, they want to submerge themselves in the water. So they would jump into the water, hopefully to avoid the quivers that Ramses was shooting at them. But you can see the result, dead Hittites floating away, right? So that what we have, and he says there were the waters were filled with dead Hittites, and not one of them was able to escape. Well, that's awfully similar to what we have in Exodus, right? They tried to run away. It says not one of them could escape. And of course, many of them met their deaths in the water, like we have here. Now, all the things that I've said it to you until now, I hope that some of you are at least a little skeptical. Okay, those things, even taking my word for it, that the things that I've told you are true, and I've written them up, you can check them after. The correspondences are true, but again, correspondences are not enough to really make a case. We have to, chariots. Maybe there were many other battles that had chariots. Maybe there are other battles that had the enemy saying, oh, their God is fighting for us. But I will tell you that the 5 or 6 things that I've mentioned, all together, all in a row, don't appear anywhere else. But now we get to the very best thing. And this is blowaway. It's blowaway. What you find in both compositions, both in the Kaddish inscriptions and in the book of Exodus, is this. What Ramses says is, okay, after I finished putting away the Hittite troops, my cowardly troops, right, who had run away before, they came back to the battlefield. And what Ramses says is, my troops surveyed the battlefield, and they saw the battlefield strewn with Hittite corpses. And as they saw all of the Hittite corpses, they saw my great hand. That's a trope in Egyptian literature, my great hand. And they came to me and offered me a hymn of praise.
This is exactly what you find at the end of Exodus 14. It says, Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim met asfat hayam. They saw the Egyptian bodies at the edge of the sea. Vayar Yisrael et hayad hagdolah. They saw God's great hand. That's not a common image throughout the Bible, but it's used a lot with regard to the Exodus. The Exodus appropriates Egyptian tropes of how they used to describe the pharaohs to describe Yahweh's victory here. And of course, the end of Exodus 14 says, and then they had, the Hittite inscription, the Egyptian inscription says, my troops saw me and were in awe of me and offered me praise. And that's exactly what you have at the end of Exodus 14. Vayar Yisrael vayaminu v'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo. They had yirah, they had awe, and they believed in Moses and in God. And then it launches into the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15. And all of the motifs are the same. It's astounding. What the Hittite the Egyptian inscription says is that the troops say, you are our savior. You boost our morale. These are the opening verses of Exodus 15. Aziva Zimratya, you're my savior. Vayhi li shua, you gave me salvation. You raised our heart. The next line in the Egyptian inscription speaks about Ramses' mighty hand doing two things. Exodus 15:6 refers to Yad Hashem, the hand of God, doing two things. The Egyptian inscription says, there is no one who is like you as a mighty, valorous victor. And this is 15:11 in Exodus, Mi kamocha b'lim Hashem, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, who is like you? And then the rest of the Egyptian inscription goes on to say the following. Let's see, now we'll go this way. Oops. I seem to have gotten stuck. Let's see. Oh, okay. Oof. I wanted that original. All right, wait. I wanted one. Hold on. Okay. Right. What the remaining parts of the Ramses, the Kaddish inscription says the following, that Ramses made his way from Kaddish, marched his troops back home to P. Ramses. And it says, as they were marching home victoriously, the presence, the sight of the victorious Egyptian legions instilled fright and fear upon all the neighbors. And then Ramses, it says at the very, very end, he arrived home in his palace and was granted rule forever and ever. And this is exactly what the end of the Song of the Sea says. After it depicts what happens to Pharaoh and his chariots at the sea, it says, and now, Lord, you will lead us through the various nations, Edom and Moab and the Plishtim, the Philistines, on our way to the Holy Land. They will be instilled with fear and trembling. You will arrive in the land. Mikdash Hashem konanu yadecha. You will build your palace. And it ends triumphantly. Hashem yimloch leolam va'ed. God will rule forever and ever. So that it all follows through from beginning to end. So I don't know. Is that a coincidence too? I think coincidence is in the eye of the coincidencer, or something like that. But this, I think, is really, really interesting information. As now, one more methodologically critical point here is to then ask, okay. There seems to be something going on here. But scholars always want to know, when could it be that Israelite culture became aware of the Kaddish inscription? Just to demonstrate how important that question is, consider the Code of Hammurabi. Let's say that we were to theoretically find a passage in the Bible that looked like it's straight out of the Code of Hammurabi. There isn't such a thing, but let's say that we did. It'll be very hard for us to determine when that influence took place, for the simple reason that the Code of Hammurabi was copied verbatim for 1,500 years, starting from the original in the middle of the 18th century BCE until the 3rd century BCE. So we would have no way of knowing when this Israelite text had become aware of the Code of Hammurabi. But here, I think that's not the case here, for the simple reason. Let's talk for a final moment about the reception history of the Kaddish inscriptions within Egypt. That phrase, reception history, means, okay, it was written whenever it was written, by whoever wrote it, Ramses, presumably, some years after the victory at Kaddish. When we want to know its reception, we want to know, how did later Egyptians take to this text? Right? The reception history of the Code of Hammurabi shows that this was a classic, almost canonical, for 1,500 years. Well, the case with the Kaddish inscriptions is vastly different, because although I said to you that we have 10 copies of the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II, all of those are from his own time. We know this because of the structures that were built. They're all from his age. And following that, it seems nobody gave two hoots about this, because the Kaddish inscriptions are very particular. It mentions names of people, and it mentions specific events. And so it really spoke to that age. We know a lot about ancient Egypt. It was never copied again anywhere past maybe the immediate next generation, but never ever more was it copied again. Never again was it even imitated. Right? Sometimes you can see a text imitates a classic text. No one thought to imitate the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II. There's no reference to it even. No one says, oh, yeah, and as it says there in the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II. It just became irrelevant. Furthermore, we have never found any monumental inscriptions from Egypt in translation, or even in the original, outside of Egypt itself. So you have little, very short inscriptions. You can go to Old Jaffa today in Tel Aviv. Yeah, there's a little arch there that has a few glyphs on it, but none of these major texts. Not in Israel, not anywhere else. Those things stayed in Egypt. Which is to say then that what we really need to ask is, well, if Israelites gained access to this, then it was probably during the generation of Ramses, and it was probably in Egypt. Can I prove that? I can't. But in terms of the epigraphic and archaeological evidence that we have, this is not an unreasonable proposition. What it suggests is that there were Israelites who were familiar with this text. That makes sense because we pointed to that papyrus that was not just in hieroglyphics, which only very well-trained scribes and priests could read, but was something that was read aloud in settings of common workers who themselves were building pyramids and things like that. And so what it suggests is that Israelites were somehow there and somehow experienced some type of victory over Ramses the Great. And the way in which they commemorated this for themselves was by appropriating that most well-known text to describe Yahweh's victory over Ramses himself. And the rest I can leave to your imagination. But that, I think, is what we are able to safely say is a reasonable reading of this material. Thank you very much.